right.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We are Certified Africa, and today is Africa Certified Fridays. And today we're going to be talking about a topic that for a long time has had a long-standing issue between African Americans and a perceived issue between African Americans and Africans. So today we're here to talk about that and really discuss the issues that bring tension between Black people and Black unity. If we are to make progress, we have to discuss the tough topics. And so today we're here to discuss it and provide solutions to this perceived issue.
All right. Good to have you all here, lovely people. Let's see if we have a few more people, then we can zoom right into the actual subject. So I think today we had a little confusion with our time. It's actually supposed to be 4:30 p.m. I think we have to mention that.
Yeah,
but
so
apparently when we did it, what do you call it?
Oh, we're on my personal.
No, it's Certified Africa.
You sure?
Yes.
No, it just says Certified Africa has joined a live video. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, we just messed up. Ooh.
Sorry, everyone. I'm having some technical difficulties over here.
Okay. Where's the
X that out. Sorry. Hi, Carlton.
Okay, all right. So yeah, we had a little technical difficulty with our Instagram, so we had to fix it real quick. So just pardon us. So it's supposed to be 4:30, actually 4:30, but because we had mistakenly kept in the post that we had done, today, 4 p.m. So that created a little confusion. So for some people who may have been, waiting at 4, that'll be right unfortunate. It's supposed to be 4:30. So we just have a few more people join, and then we could kick right into the subject. It's a little tricky subject, but we'll just take it easy and, have a conversation or a discussion,
about it. Yeah.
So hey, Captain, good to see you as always. Good to see you. Good to see you, my brother. Nana Kwame Kunedu. Hey, Nana, good to have you here. Good to have you. We'll zoom right into it, surely. Right into it. Good to have you. Yep. Hey, how is Dominase, Nana Kwame? All right. Beautiful. So just a few minutes. We have 3 minutes to 4:30, then we can launch into it. All right, so we have Pius joining us.
Yeah, Francis. Hi, Francis. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for joining. We'll jump right into it shortly. 3 minutes. It's Africa's Certified Fridays. Africa Certified Fridays. We're certifying Africa, basically. Yeah, and it's 4:30 every Friday. So if you're new, hey, we want you to catch us every Friday. We'll deal with different subjects. It's all about Africa at the end of the day. As you can see, I rep Certified Africa.
Yeah.
Okay. What time is it in Ghana? It's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's 8 in Ghana. Okay. Yeah, Bias Domina say, yeah, good. I mean, I need to be there soon. I mean, Domina say is a place, I think, in the central region. They have some amazing festivals that, I've had the privilege of attending a number of times, I think twice or so, and it's so beautiful. So yes, if in Ghana you want to enjoy festivals, you can check out the Abiate Anobae Festival, I think. Yes, with Dasebre Kwebwe Usi. Yeah, it's a great African king.
Oh, okay.
Oh yeah, it's 8:30 in Ghana. Okay, good.
Hello, Simon. Thank you for joining. We're about to get started.
It's good that we have, based on the subjects that we're about to discuss, it's good that we have both Africans in Africa, Africans in the diaspora, and African Americans, be part of that conversation, because that's how we could resolve some of the perceived tensions that kind of seem to be out here done. So
thank you for joining.
Thank you for joining. We'll get right into it. Let me see. All right, 1 minute.
Hello.
Thank you all for joining. We appreciate you all. Thank you for joining. So like I was saying, it's good we have all the groups here as we dive into this conversation. Rogers, good to have you. Yeah, I think it's Rogers.
Yes,
good to have you. Thank you for joining. Yeah. All right. This key which we're discussing today. Okay, Simon. Simon wants us to pin what we're discussing today.
Yeah, we can't do it right now.
Yeah, because we're
So right now we are discussing the perceived topic of African, or tensions between African Americans and Africans, and we're going to be diving into that topic, because if we are to have Black unity, if we are to have Black unity, and if we are to make progress as Black people, we have to talk about and discuss the tough issues. And so today we'll be diving into that topic, and we have audiences of both Africans living in Africa, Africans in the diaspora, and African Americans joining us today. So we're going to be talking about this topic, and we hope that everybody contributes. We'll be sure to read all of the comments, questions, and really just dialogue. Okay.
All right, so let me get this.
One moment. Okay, then you can pin it like this. There you go.
All right.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for your patience.
All right. So, Simon, there you go. You have it right there. Tensions between African Americans and Africans, and we're going a little deep today. So it's 4:30. So we'll zoom right into it. Thank you all for joining. So when we're done going through what we have, then we could take the questions and see how we could best address them. So I like, first of all, to mention the fact that there's a subject that we have to talk about it in love. We don't have to talk about it from a place of anger. We don't have the conversation from a place of anger, in that respect, or hate among each other. It's something that we have to come to the table and talk about it in love. And also, let's recognize that at the end of the day, and I'm starting with the end. I'm basically starting with the end. Mm-hmm. That at the end of the day, we're Black people. Whether you live in Africa, whether you live in America, whether you're African American, whether you're from the Caribbean, at the end of the day, we're Black people, and that's what should stand. That's what should be the priority, irrespective of the disparities that we may find. As people, we have to appreciate the fact that at the end of the day, we are Black people, and that's what matters. That we must come together to unite, and that's how we win. It's very key and it's very basic. So we're discussing the tensions between African Americans and Africans in Africa, and then also Africans in America. So there are three separate groups that I believe that this conversations, revolves around. Very key. Now, I like to first of all note that the African American story, as you may have it, is a psychological or mental experience, okay, and not a physical issue. So anytime we're discussing and you hear things about the African American experience, sometimes we try to look at it in terms of the physical. But I don't think it's a physical event. Of course, a lot of physical events have happened in the past and some still happen. But it's more of a psychological issue. So we deal with it in that respect. It's not about the physical conditions we live in. Because you see, two people can have the same physical conditions right now. But the state of mind or the psychological experience that they're having is very different. And so we like to recognize that. Go ahead.
What I wanted to point out, and what do we mean by psychological experience? Or what do we mean by people have different psychological experiences? We mean the experiences that make up who we are, your values, your experiences, the things that you are proud of, the things that define the things that have been passed on generationally, the things that everything that has defined who you are leading up to this point, your history, your roots, all of that. So you take all of that into what we call a psychological experience. It defines who we are and what embodies who we are, these stories that we carry with us.
So we're basically going to make our case. We'll make our case, and then we'll give some suggestions of how we think we could, make progress moving forward. A lot of progress have been made, and still more is being made. Now, so I'll first of all look at it from Africans in Africa. The question is, if you're going to be able to discuss or look into the tensions between us, we need to know where each other is coming from. Now, growing up in Africa, of course, I've lived in Africa over 20 years, so at least I'm quite qualified to talk about how Africans feel, or us, to a large extent, the general notions on the continent. Okay, so now Africans in Africa, the reality is that in growing up, we're never taught anything, I can tell you for a fact, about the African American struggle. We're never done that, whether pre or post slavery. We never had the opportunity to really be taught all of these things. Now, I can consider myself a first generation African, like a lot of people will call first generation Africans in America. I will consider myself a first generation African in Africa. Now, my parents didn't have the list of the opportunities that I had, in the sense that I had a chance to at least go to school. And in school, they get to teach us a few things. So that's an advantage that we have as first generation Africans living in Africa. Now, my parents didn't have any of this experience at all. Now, when I was going to school, the things that it taught us about anything that has to do with, of course, our forefathers or ancestors who were taken away, has to do with the transatlantic slave trade. And that's all they taught us, that a group of people came down as colonial, whoever, came to conquer, do all kinds of exchanges. And at the end of the day, they took some of our forefathers away. And they took some to Caribbeans, and they took some to Americas. And then, of course, that triangle kind of went on for a little bit. But that's what they taught us. And then they eventually teach you at the end of the lesson that in the year maybe 18 something, this act was ended, or the abolition of the slave trade, and it was ended. And that's about all they teach us. Of course, it's the surface. So growing up, all we've known, those of us who had a chance to at least go to school, was to learn a little bit about slavery, of how some people were taken, but then it was abolished and it ends there. That's all we know. Okay. Now, our parents, a lot of them never even had the opportunity to have this type of knowledge or experience. So now, from the African perspective, growing up, you have no concern or no business or no sentiment about somebody else's struggle in America. That's a reality. The average African, I can tell you for a fact, using myself as an example. Now, for a lot of African countries, I've come to realize that actually a lot of them didn't even learn about slavery in the first place. They didn't even learn about slavery because their countries had a lot of different wars. Like Nigeria, they had their own civil wars that they were dealing with. And these were the things we were teaching them in what we call social studies. So we in Ghana, we were even lucky, at least they taught us a little bit about the slave trade, because a lot of the castles were there. Now, another thing that I can tell you for a fact from the African perspective, living in Africa, is the fact that we have a slave castle that you could go there to learn a few things. But the reality is that a lot of people have even never been there. My parents have lived in Ghana for so many years. They really never got a chance to experience the castle, but it's right under their nose. And that's the reality. So in fact, the extent that you can go, even the first generation Africans who live in Africa like myself, who could go to the castle and even see the conditions that our ancestors were in before they were taken away, we never get a chance to have that contact. So in the first place, what I'm establishing is that for the African living in Africa, when we talk about the struggle that the African American may have gone through, or the ancestors may have gone through all the way till present day, they really have no identification with that. That's the reality. We don't. We hear stories, but we really don't understand that. Now, few of us who get to go to school, learn about the slavery, we don't really get to go in there. So we still end up having no real knowledge about it. All we know is according to what the textbooks tell us. That's the reality. Now, also, you have Africans in Africa who hardly, of course, get the opportunity to travel outside. Now, when you travel outside, don't forget, Africans living in Africa, majority are black. They look like them. So they've never really experienced anything about being the minority, including myself. I've never done that, experiencing anything about being a minority. So all your life, you're growing up knowing that you are the majority. Although you know there's been historic issues of slavery, people coming to take people away and all of that, but you really have not experienced it. until we have those who get a chance to travel out, then maybe you have a little feel of it. So the thinking begins to change a little bit. So now, what I'm establishing is when you encounter an African in Africa, and maybe you're expecting them to identify with your story of where we have come from, it is very hard for us to do that because we have no knowledge of it. Nobody has taught us that from schools, and nobody's having discussions about that. Even the castles, the slave dungeons that represents that, we hardly have the chance to visit there. We don't visit there. We don't even have that basic knowledge. So that's where the African is coming from in this conversation of whether or not there's a tension because we don't get each other. That's where the African is coming from. Now, that brings me to, in coming to America and, of course, being able to appreciate what it means to be a majority. You can jump in if you want. What it means to be a minority in a majority place. Because I had the opportunity, like I said, to go to school, learn a few things about slavery, but not in depth. But in coming to America, it also opened my eyes even further to begin to appreciate the conversations around living as a minority, the fears that it comes with, so that when I'm engaging with an African American, I come from a better appreciation of where we have come from, or where we have come from before we are at this point. So I relate to you in a different way. Now, don't forget, like I established, that my parents never had the opportunity to experience that. So whether in living in Africa or in traveling outside of the African continent, they never had any touch with this idea. So don't forget, they're coming to the conversation with a different background, a different thought, a different ideology. So even if the two of you have the same experience in America in terms of day-to-day living, they still really do not appreciate where we have come from and what the stories are like. Okay, now let me deal a little more with Africans who moved to America. Now, in the midst of what transpires between Africans and African Americans who encounter themselves in Africa, we also have a group of Africans who have actually made it to the US, to the UK, and different other places. And that's where we actually see the real tension between Africans and African Americans. Now, so we'll look at it from the Africans that made it here from the beginning. These are my parents, and maybe some of them, their parents, based on your age, their parents. Now, those people, like I said, have no knowledge of what anything slavery, anything civil rights, anything of what transpired in the past. They really have no knowledge of that. So they are coming to America from a standpoint of we're Black people, and we've got a chance to come to America. Some people, maybe they came as doctors. Some came with nothing. Through different hustle and struggle, they managed to make it to America or some other places. So, but they're coming from different backgrounds. And when they get here, it becomes a level playing field for the African who have made their way to America. To them, we're all Black people who find ourselves in a place that we're about to hustle and find a way out. So when the African encounters those days for our parents, when they encounter an African American, they look at you as a Black person like they're Black. Maybe you have nothing, they have nothing. So all of us are about to start building life from a certain place. And this is where the tensions begin to come in, because now for the African, because he's able to build something from scratch based on where he's coming from, the mindset, the background, the values that they have, like my wife said. Now, they've used that to, of course, maybe build something for themselves. And they look around them in their neighborhoods and all of that. And they feel like they see other people who are, of course, African Americans, but then maybe they are not building the same way they're building. They came from somewhere where they came to start from scratch. And they feel like once you're also here, you should be able to start from the scratch and be able to build something up. So when they see certain signs, they begin to develop a whole bunch of stereotypes, against the people that they are meeting here that looks like them. But they are not recognizing that what we are dealing with, or what the African American is dealing with, has nothing to do with the physical circumstance at the time. But they are looking at something that has been historic, and therefore it's psychological. And not a physical circumstance. So for our parents who came to America as first generations, that has contributed hugely to the tension between Africans and African Americans. The reality is that based on their background and the things that they've known, they do not really understand or appreciate the African American experience or story. So obviously they're going to tag the African American as things like maybe they are lazy. And we hear that all the time, which is part of the things that have created the tension. We hear things like, you don't like school. I mean, you're part African American, so you could talk about some of the things that
I've heard some of those narratives that, you know, Black people are or African Americans are lazy. They don't work, you know, they don't work hard as we do. They come they have the opportunities just like we have. Why don't they work as hard as we do? Or, you know, what are some of the other ones? You know, we're not really focused on all of these.
Same schools.
Oh yeah, access to the same schools. You know,
the police stops all of us. You know, of course,
or
the police don't stop only one person.
I'm not really focused on, you know, all these race issues. I'm just focused on this. And why do they always have to talk about, you know, race? Why is that always brought up? Those types of, you know, sentiments. But of course, you know, there is the disconnect because they're not understanding that, you know, African Americans have had a traumatic experience, which allows us to perceive certain events differently. You know, we're just wired differently. And so I think, you know, what's key is that we begin to have more discussions about this. And, you know, like what you said, many people may not realize that that's where people are coming from, you know? So
you realize that people have our parents who came to America tend to have all these bias, maybe genuinely, genuine concerns like they'll have for any other Black person, whether African or African American, that these people are these things, without considering, you know, several factors that accounts for the historic reasons why maybe things are the way they are and why a certain group of people function the way they function. And it will take a lot of different things to be able to break out of maybe that cycle, still recognize where you're coming from, but then at least maybe do something different. Okay, it's very difficult for our parents to understand that. Now, a lot of people have argued when it comes to first generation Africans in America. A lot of people have argued that, of course, a lot of first generation Africans were born in America. A lot of them came to America when they were very young. So therefore, the argument is that, well, some of them are born not in rich homes. And a lot of them have had to struggle just like maybe they're African American in the same neighborhoods. Okay, so they've all had to struggle and then grow up together. So they come with that, from that background that, well, we all grew up in maybe in New York, or we all grew up in Florida. You were born, I was born like that. So we all grew up. So really, I kind of understand where you're coming from just because I was also born where? I was also born here. But you see, the reason why people say that is because they are looking at the African American experience from the physical perspective. So they're thinking that because we're in the same neighborhood, the police stops all of us. We have access to the same schools. So because of that, I appreciate, or I kind of fully understand maybe what it means to be African American. I tell people that you can never fully understand what it means to be African American unless you're African American. That's the reality. Because I'm telling you, everything that a person goes through has to start from their childhood and what they're taught from home, or the encounters they've had right from childhood. So the fact that we're having a physical experience together, that we're all growing up in the same neighborhood, the police is stopping all of us because we are Black. The reality is that one person, two people having the same physical experience, but they're having two different psychological experiences. And I'll show you why that is the case. Now, think about it. Let me look at the African American perspective. When an African American is born, they're born growing up carrying a lot of what I call psychological baggage or experience.
Trauma.
That has been passed on from generations to generations. You can call it trauma, like my wife said. That has been passed on from generation to generations, knowingly or unknowingly. So a lot of people, it's not deliberate. It's just passive. Now, how do African Americans, how do they come about that experience or that baggage? How does it come about? It comes about right from home, maybe the parents, based on previous experiences that have happened. Now, when every parent have a child, they raise a child based on what they've known and what they've been taught. So gradually, once you're born to an African American parent, trust me, the reality is that what my mom will teach me as an African parent, it is very different from the things that an African American parent will share with an African American. Just talking about same with other race. So the reality is that right from home, these people are taught different type of things, although you are all in the same neighborhood, although you're all stopped by the police, but everybody's coming from a different place. Now, another way is that now, African Americans go for family meetings, family reunions, family gatherings, and all of that. Now, maybe an African American's parent at home may not talk about some of the experience and the struggle and all of that. where it becomes something that, of course, it becomes an experience for them, whether they are from a rich or a poor home. But then we go for all these family gatherings and there are conversations growing up. And all these things keep registering in the minds of people. So gradually, it becomes your experience too, because that is who you are. That is where you're coming from. So it becomes your experience automatically. You don't have to do anything about it. Now, you also have African Americans interacting with themselves. Somebody has learned something. They begin to share. This is our experience. And some people, they also learn some of it. They gather some of the information of what their fathers have been through throughout the generations till now. So they get a chance to learn some of these things from there as well. Now, you also have some of these people learning. You also have African Americans building up this experience from historic events like Juneteenth, like Martin Luther King Day. Now, when these things happen, the way an African, I will appreciate that event is very different from how an African American, somebody born African American, will appreciate it. So now the two people are living in the same place and are different, the same circumstances, but their realities are shaping in a different way based on where they are coming from. That's the reality. So now this is building to show you that when we are going to have conversations, we have to come from a place of understanding of ourselves, of where we are coming from, and not come from a place where, because, especially for first generation Africans, because I think that's where a lot of the tension starts, and it tends to affect even people in Africa eventually, because of course we've also come from Africa, so that's how it is perceived, or even those who are born here. So it comes from a place where we feel that we kind of fully 100% appreciate being what it means to be African American, because we live in the same neighborhoods, because the police stops all of us, because we all maybe sometimes get food stamps based on the background we have. You know, we think we all appreciate the same, but no, it's different, because these people are taught different things. So, okay, for first generation Africans, growing up, if you talk to any first generation African, they'll tell you, because their parents came from Africa. So their parents knew different values, different mindset. They didn't even identify with slave trade and all of those things. They didn't identify with that. So when they give birth to a child, the reality is that we create two different types of first generation Africans, just to point that out. We have those who, of course, they all come from the same place. They have those who get a chance, maybe to go to school, to learn a lot of different things. A lot of them do a lot of different research. They become more enlightened. So, of course, they begin to gradually appreciate from the psychological standpoint where maybe the African American is coming from. So when they're having conversations, they have it differently. Now, but for the majority, the reality is that it is based on what their parents at home is actually teaching them growing up, and the kind of comments they are passing. This is how kids learn and pick up things. So they don't deliberately want to put themselves in that position, but gradually, based on what parents are saying at home and all of that, because don't forget where they are coming from, they begin to pass that on to the first generation Africans. So when a first generation African now encounters an African American, they're confronting them from the things that their parents have been saying at home. That's the reality, and that's what begins the tension. So they think that because they were all born in America and because they've been able to make it as a medical doctor, every African American who have not been able to make it, they feel like you should be able to make it. And because they're not enlightened, why haven't you made it? Because they're not enlightened to understand that the kind of experience that they have mentally or psychologically growing up is very different. And it doesn't matter whether you are born in America or you're not. Once your parents are coming from Africa and they have different values, different background, different mindset, your upbringing becomes different. For those who are able to learn, become enlightened, begin to try to understand what's going on, they tend to interact with African Americans a lot different. Now, let's look at you want to talk about African Americans a little bit.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that you made a good point. When you said that the two separate, or the two groups tend to separate, and you have two different types of first generation Africans. And one thing that kind of piqued was that you kind of have this perceived, or this perception of what you've said. You have one who has taken the ideals, the values, the psychological upbringing from their parents, and now it's being perceived from African Americans as, oh, Africans think they're better than African Americans, or they're superior in some sort of way. Why do they look down upon us? And so I think that it's important for you to point out that, because of that particular upbringing, we're being perceived differently. And I have heard those comments of, African, my parent doesn't like African Americans. They think African Americans are lazy, or they think African Americans are this. But I've also had the chance to sit down and find out, okay, well, why is it that way? And when we have when I've had these discussions with people, what has come out is, they feel as if, I've come here, I've worked so hard. Why are Black Americans this way? And of course, I've had a chance to explain and talk about, the fact that we've been here, we've endured 400 years plus of slavery, mental slavery, physical slavery. All of these things take a toll on Black minds, Black bodies. And so our experience is different. We walk with that trauma on a day-to-day basis. And so I think that when I've had those conversations and been able to speak with Africans about, how we feel as African Americans when, it seems as if you're looking down upon us, I think that bringing that out, or bringing that piece out, has helped open up the dialogue and help us to understand each other.
So I think what people need to recognize, what the two divides need to recognize, the two groups need to recognize, is that there's an issue in terms of where we are both coming from and the experiences we've had, okay, from generations up until this point. And when we begin to recognize that, then we begin to dialogue with each other differently, so that when I see an African American who may not be doing well, I don't conclude that this African American is lazy or this African American is like that, because I appreciate where they're coming from and the fact that it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of different factors for a person to be able to move or leave that baggage, that experience behind, recognize it, but then leave it behind and be able to forge forward. It takes a lot. When you begin to recognize that, maybe we as Africans recognize that, we can begin to have a different conversation with African Americans, not from a point of we're all fighting from a playing field because maybe we all live in America or maybe we all have the same opportunities around. But no, we're coming from different backgrounds, different historic backgrounds. So the thinking is different. We're brought up different. So once we begin to appreciate that, then we can begin to find solutions to forge forward. We can begin to find things that makes us come together, things that we have in common more in order to be able to forge forward. That's the reality. So here's the thing. The supposed tension is not really a big tension. It's just understanding of each other, of where we have come from, and now respecting each other's experience and not trying to make it look like, well, I get your experience, but yet still you have to be able to do AYZ. That's when we come from that perspective, we're going to keep creating this confusion that shouldn't be existing between us. So we have to shift away from that. So that's, if we really go into it and think about this whole idea of there's a tension, African Americans hate Africans and Africans hate African Americans, you realize that it's just a simple knowledge of appreciation of each other's experience. And basically that's it. And we're not judging each other. I think that becomes a crucial thing. The time we begin to appreciate that, and that's what our parents who came to America earlier didn't get. But a new generation, we're having a new generation that is gradually appreciating the different circumstances of each other. And we're beginning to align more. And having conversations like that, like this, is also helping to be able to close up the supposed gap that exists between the two groups. Now we'll make some suggestions to both groups, make some suggestions and see how we could forge forward as a group. So first of all, for Africans in Africa, okay, and of course, Africans in America, one solution that I think that can help mitigate the situation and create less tension, whenever it arises, will be for the school system to begin having in their coursework details of post-slavery through the civil rights era as much as possible.
And this is in Africa.
This is in Africa. Now, from the African perspective, a lot of the tension, trust me, don't arise there. A lot of the attention arises once the Africans come here, and then the notion is created. So when you go to Africa, you're even on your guard because of what you've experienced or what you've heard from here. So the reality is that in Africa, because our parents didn't get to hear all of these things, and even as of this point, a lot of people still don't have idea about the slave trade and all of that, it will be more of a policy issue. That because if I was growing up, and maybe I was taught for most countries, they never was taught even slavery. I never really was taught anything about civil rights and the real struggle that African Americans were going through here, so that when I meet an African American, I can really understand, I can really appreciate their story more, so that they don't say things and I'll be like, whoa, look, get over it. Get over it. I mean, it's long gone, so get over it. I begin to appreciate that, no, this is real. This is real. Not something you can just get over like that. So I begin to relate differently. I don't say things that will be offensive to them. So I think it's a policy issue, first of all, to be able to mitigate a situation where in our schools, they'll begin to go further and teach us beyond transatlantic slave trade that there has been a real struggle in America for Black people that look like us. So therefore, when a Black American come to Africa and they're relating, they're trying to let you understand their story, you don't look down upon them and think that, oh, what are you talking about? I mean, let that go and things like that. So that's one first thing I think we can actually do. You know, this will raise a generation that has better understanding from childhood, how people from your family, you know, has been taken and have struggled and now are actually making their way back. We can start from the younger people that are in schools now. If our school systems in Africa can begin to teach us, I'm telling you, there'll be a lot of progress made for the next generation, where the supposed gap will technically be eliminated and there'll be no gap. It will just be about we being Black, because we all understand what we're dealing with. We understand where you're coming from. You understand where I'm coming from. Okay, so this will rather, if we go to, just let me chip this in. It's funny when you go to Africa, bit personal experience, when living in Ghana, when we see white people, no offense to them, but it looks as if we kind of even appreciate them or welcome them more than when we see other people who speak like that, but then do not look like them.
Yeah,
that's the reality, and it's very sad when you come to the realization of that in fact we rather revere other people who don't look like us than those who actually look like us. I think that's rather a sad situation.
I think that has also been one of the topics of, like, you know, I am, like, this is one example. I'm an African American who wants to connect to my roots. I really want to, you know, be accepted. I don't know my history when it comes to things that were taught to me, because all that was taught to me was Black people arrived in America and our history begins in slavery. We were not taught our lineage prior to that. We were not taught about, you know, who we come from. And so, you know, it makes it very hard when I'm an African American who wants to come and get, you know, connect to my roots, and I'm not welcomed. You know, people have issues with being called a brony or being called a foreigner. And it's like, you know, was it my fault that, you know, I was taken away, or my ancestors were taken away to America and that we went through slavery? No, we were forcibly taken away. And that is that part that, you know, we wish so deeply to have, that connection that we wish so deeply to have. We just don't have it because we weren't born in Africa. And so to come back and not be, you know, accepted and called a foreigner and understood and be called a foreigner, that hurts. That's painful for people sometimes. And so I think that it's key for them to understand.
Yeah, exactly. And that's because of the knowledge base, the education base. We've not integrated these things into even our schooling system. So at least those who get the opportunity to go to school can be able to learn some of these things. So firsthand, knowledge is power. Right from childhood, they're able to really appreciate at least face value even before they encounter these people from the outside who looks like them but speaks differently. They begin to appreciate that more because they have a knowledge about that. So the knowledge gap in Africa, in terms of the African American story, is something that must really be taught. Now, another point that I think could help the situation to blur out that line is Africans who get the opportunity to travel outside. Okay? It's very key that anytime they get a chance to go back, that is first generation Africans, even Africans who are born here, who have African parents, when in learning and understanding what it means to be a minority and understanding what it means for the African American to have been through up until this point, when you go back to Africa, it's in your place to now begin to educate whoever is there that, hey, brothers and sisters, look, this struggle we're talking about is real. So, of course, when you see an African American, you now begin to look at the things differently based on the knowledge that your sibling has passed on. So it's also our obligation as Africans. We don't just come here and make the arguments, but when we go back, it's in our place to begin to educate our brothers and sisters for them to be able to understand that look, it's not easy to be a minority somewhere. So if a group of people have been minorities for so many years, it doesn't come easy. It is something that takes a lot to be able to make progress. So they begin to have understanding in that respect. Now, another way I think this can also be mitigated is today, luckily, a lot of African Americans have had opportunities to move back to the continent, which is beautiful. I appreciate that. We need more people to move. So the people who have moved, I believe that if we begin to have knowing where we've come from and some of the supposed tensions that we keep talking about, and the knowledge gap in terms of Africans appreciating what it is to be maybe African American in terms of the historic story, if we begin to initiate initiatives that can really go down to give knowledge to people who are back home, especially young people, children, that look, this struggle that we've been through is so real. I think that will make a lot of difference because you are there, you are living there. So you have the opportunity to come up with all kinds of initiatives to see how you can, exactly, to bridge that gap. And there's a man in Ghana called Aboma who has done a great job. If you go to Ghana, there's a place called Pram Pram where he has built what he calls the ancestral wall. And on the ancestral wall, he has a lot of ancestors that are there, both from the US and all over Africa. And he brings students, he allows students from all schools in Ghana to come by, and then he teaches them about the faces on the wall, all these people and what they represent. And that helps him to be able to teach these kids some of the struggle that the African American has gone through. So when the child is growing up, gradually they're beginning to understand and appreciate more when they encounter their fellow African Americans. And it's a great initiative that he's doing at Prom Prom. People can take that up on other parts of the continent, African Americans who have moved, and begin to start initiatives like that. That will help a lot. Now, for new generation Africans born in America or grew up in America, they also must be very informed because there are a lot of that I've seen. Don't forget, not every African, first generation African gets a chance to maybe go to school, gets a chance to really read and be informed. So you meet one African who maybe is not informed, and you have an interaction and they make a comment. And maybe it brings out this tension that we're talking about. It generalizes. So as part of the solutions, I believe that from the Africans' perspective, first generation Africans who have made it hard to come to America or be born in America, we have to educate ourselves and understand that, look, we cannot make progress by all these comments that we keep passing and all these judgments that we keep making based on what our parents may have said to us growing up. These biases doesn't help. So we have to inform ourselves that, hey, look, this struggle that these people may have gone through is real. So if some of them haven't gotten over it, the best way is to see how we can have conversations and not rather to hit triggers, things that triggers that whole experience altogether. Because trust me, not everybody have been able to work through that situation. So for you to make certain comments, you're triggering a lot of different things. So we must learn that as well to be able to have a better relationship. And that will affect the relationship that eventually happens on the African continent. And another part that I think is very key, and then we'll talk about that when we're talking about race, even with other races, is that when you give birth, new generation Africans that are giving birth, we have to begin to reorient our children differently because that's how we can make progress. I always look at the next generation. We can begin to make progress. When you have kids in America as a first generation African, you have to be able to inculcate certain things into your child. The knowledge base, the things that you tell them, what your parents told you, you don't communicate the same things to your kids because now you know better. You've had the experience. You've lived here as a minority born. You've had interactions. You know that this is not an easy thing to get over. It takes time and it takes a lot of work for those who get a chance to do that. So when you give birth, that's one of the ways we can begin to eliminate these things so that the next generation will begin to see no lines. They begin to see everybody as black, and that's what it is, and not whether you're from Africa or you're from America as an African American. We begin to blend those lines if we do that through our kids at home once we're given birth. So that's one of the huge ways that we can also look at that, and Africans must not discourage African Americans. This point is very key. Must not discourage African Americans who are doing their best to connect with the African culture.
Yeah, so key.
Because a lot of African Americans I have met, are trying their best. They're trying to they enjoy the African part of them, and they're trying to live the African culture. You see some of them talking in a certain way, wearing beads and all of that, and you see Africans looking at them with a side eye, especially those here in America, looking at them with a side eye, oh, you're trying to be African. Like, I don't get it. Like, they're Africans. So when we begin to make such sentiments based on they trying to experience the culture, that is a big discouragement. And that still creates more tension to think that these people have not accepted us yet, or they are not accepting us. Maybe it may not even be the case, but by these comments that we pass, where we are not supportive of our African brothers and sisters who are trying their best to experience the culture, to live the African culture, we discourage them by our comments and our lack of support. So you want to touch on that subject?
I think you hit it pretty well on the head. I think that, there a lot of times, because we don't have that connection, or because we don't understand African culture, sometimes it may be perceived, or because that was not taught to us in school, sometimes it may be perceived as, why are they trying to be something that, Africa is not even like, sometimes, people are, in trying to connect to our roots, we look at, okay, what was African spirituality like? And we may not have even been to Africa, but now we're practicing a particular African spirituality. And some people who are living in Africa, or maybe first generation Africans who are here, who are just kind of like, a lot of people don't even practice that in Africa. And so I think there needs to be an understanding of, okay, they're just trying to connect to the culture. They're trying to be a part of that Africanness. How can we, teach them about the culture? I don't see too many people trying to teach about the culture. It's just kind of like, okay, this is our culture. This is what I grew up with. And we're kind of over here trying to understand, okay, but how do we learn about that culture? How do we be a part of it? And so I think there has to be an active piece on both sides to say, okay, how can we invite them in and explain what the culture is all about, and respect their lack of knowledge about some of these cultural issues?
Yeah, when you see an African American wearing an African outfit, like give them some serious encouragement. Like, yeah, I mean, this is how we do it in Africa. Exactly. You need to come to Africa. This is how we do it. This is, I mean, yeah, you rocked it right. We encourage them that, hey, like, if you feel like maybe they did something that you feel like culturally, maybe that's not supposed to be done, you teach them that, hey, look, man, you can do it like this. And you can ask them, you do it with love. So they don't see that as a discouragement, or you trying to think that you are more African than them. That is a discouragement. We don't help in blurring the supposed tension between us. Okay, now the last thing that I think is a suggestion for Africans, for Africans in Africa, and also Africans in America, first generation Africans, is for us to create more conversations like this, where we get to really talk and see how best we can iron out issues, where people get to bring out their views because these are our opinions. A lot of people have different opinions. We can create different platforms where we have these conversations. People have these conversations about, what it means for us to be able to work together, to coexist together. We need to have more conversations like this, and I think that will go a long way to
and I
to
think
help.
just like a word of advice to us as African Americans, I think that if we're constantly carrying this whole opinion that Africans don't like us, or Africans hate African Americans, or they think that they're better than us, if you're carrying that particular weight with you in every interaction that you have with an African, then now you've automatically kind of cut off your ability to relate to people, because everyone is not like that. Everyone is not like that. I have heard comments that are negative about African Americans, and in the same token, I have been accepted and loved and welcomed into a culture by Africans. And it was only when I took a step back and stopped trying to, have these perceptions or perceived notions in my head, that I was able to be welcomed in. And I think that sometimes our notions of what people may be thinking about us, or what we've heard, that stops us from being able to connect really with people, and for there to be understanding and dialogue, because you're already coming in thinking, oh, they hate us, or, oh, they don't appreciate what we've been through, or our struggle. And so we have to kind of put that to the back and just try to welcome a conversation and see how it turns out, instead of just writing it off altogether.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, that's it's a suggestion, of course, for we can, it's not just about Africans. Of course, I'm sure somebody is wondering, oh, maybe it's all about Africans and maybe what we do and all of that. But how about the African Americans? Yes, they can also do something like she's talking about. We also have these preconceived notions that they don't like. In fact, I've heard people personally say that you guys sold us, you guys sold us. I've had a lot of comments like that. But you see, such comments does not help the situation, because what you're failing to do is you're also failing to learn the African story, the African history. Because again, I always say Africans also have their own story. Whilst all the things that were happening in America was happening, Africans also was having a different kind of experience altogether. So as much as we must learn the African American story, African Americans must also learn the African story. That, okay, a lot of different things have transpired in Africa as well. So I'm learning your ways so we can both meet at a point. So that's some of the work that people must put in. You know, you can just go about and say, well, the haters, they do that, but you never take the time to find out a few things, to learn more about these other people and why maybe it is even the case. So these are things that we need to go into, rather than making comments like the haters, the soldiers, they did that and they did that, they did that. All of that doesn't help at all. So I feel like African Americans should also learn the African story and see where we've also come from. Because trust me, we've also have a long history.
You know, I can kind of see where this might head. Okay, but nobody has ever taught us. We don't really know. It's true. A lot of times African Americans don't know their history, or they've been all the way through, or the history prior to slavery. And, you know, I think it's important. That is why we must take the journey back home. That is why we must go to Africa, you know, because you can't really understand just from a textbook, or you can't really understand from a book, and you may not be able to get it from somebody on the side of the road. So go back, have the experience, find people who are open, welcoming, and willing to show you, and willing to teach you the culture, because they're here. You know, I experienced so many people who were open to me when I went to Ghana. Like, when I showed that I had a sincere, genuine interest in learning about the culture, learning the language, people opened up their homes to me, their arms to me, and welcomed me in. And I think when we go and make that step and show that we're genuinely interested and that we want to connect, people will react the same way to us.
And for those, to be fair, for those who are never maybe going to ever travel to Africa, because I met a man who told me he's never sure he's going to jump on a plane to Africa. So there are those who may never do that. But the reality is that if you never do that, knowledge is abound today. Information is everywhere. There are a lot of Africans who live in America. Be open-minded and have a conversation with people with time. Maybe you meet one, let me say, crazy African who have all kinds of crazy ideas and lousy ideas about all of this and the history and all of that. You can move on, find the next African who really knows what he's talking about, and have a conversation, have a dialogue. And that's how we can begin to do away with all the notions that maybe we have as well as African Americans. Then we can begin to come to the table and we can both begin to make progress. One of the suggestions that I think I have for African Americans, I mean, for sure, I can tell you, for a lot of African Americans, not all, is the fact that we must undergo a healing process. Because if you look at where we've come from, trust me, it's a lot of baggage or experience that is passed on from generation after generation. Whether you agree or disagree, but there has to be a healing process through different ways. So you have to figure out how you can go through a healing process. You know, how can I heal myself? And as part of the healing process, sometimes moving away for some time helps with the healing process, because the things that constantly remind us of all the baggage that we are carrying, if it keeps being with us and we keep seeing it consistently, it's very hard to heal. So as part of the healing process, sometimes people must move away in order to be able to heal. And Africa could be a good place. I've seen Black people who have moved to Costa Rica just to be able to heal. I've seen Black people who have been in America and they've been able to heal. Everybody have different experience, but we must allow ourselves to go through a healing process. I've seen a lot of people who feel like, yeah, well, I'm okay. I mean, I don't think my past affects me in any way. Yes, your past may not affect you. You know, but you have to appreciate the fact that this could be a baggage that you have to deal with. So we have to go through some healing process. The second part that I'll talk about as a suggestion for African Americans is, you know, taking time to really work on yourself constantly to stay strong and forge forward. Because I'm telling you that the odds in terms of all the historic events that happen in America, it doesn't affect other races like it affect African Americans. Chinese people will come and argue, Mexicans will come and argue, even Africans from Africa will come and argue. But I bet you the experience for African Americans is very different. So therefore, if the odds are against you to a large extent, you have to constantly be working on yourself without excuses. Like you have to constantly work on yourself so we can make a lot of change and a lot of progress. A lot of people have worked on themselves and are still doing that, and they're making so much progress. So all these conversations we have, really, they feel like it doesn't concern them. They don't really care because they've made progress. So a lot of us, we must keep teaching other people that, hey, you need to constantly work on yourself. You need to constantly work on yourself as an African American so you can do away with the past. Now, another part that I think is very key is making a conscious effort as an African American, not to dwell on the past as an entitlement or a reason not to make progress. Now, it does not mean you do not recognize your past. Now, you can use your past as a tool either to make progress or to be set back. So it's up to you and how you watch your past. I've seen a lot of African Americans, I've spoken to a few of them, who feel so entitled to their past and their past experience. And they are not feeling entitled to it as a way to forge forward, but as a reason why maybe they shouldn't make progress or why maybe they are the way they are.
Wrapped up in the trauma of the experience, that trauma becomes like their pride and joy. Or exactly. That trauma becomes what makes who they are. It happens to us.
Become detrimental to you.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, you're trying to fight to win, but you're fighting to lose. That becomes disastrous. And let me tell you a little story about something I call the wake. Now, the wake is when a boat moves, the trail that is here, he left like a triangular trail behind anytime the boat is moving. Now, the question is, when the person on the boat, when you stand behind the boat and you're looking at the wake, now the question is whether or not the wake has what it takes to drive the boat. Now, the answer is obviously no. The wake represents all your past experiences as a person, all the things that you've been through. That does not have what it takes to drive your life to where you want your life to go. So now when you stand and looking back at all that has happened, and you're using that, thinking that will shape in or determine where your life or your boat is headed, your boat will head to the wrong direction and crash. So although it's genuine that you had all those experiences, but you should not allow that to determine where you're moving to. That is very key, and it takes a lot of conscious effort for people to be able to do that. Not just African Americans, but everybody around the world. But especially in this context, for African Americans, the idea of the past, we not just appreciating the past and using that to strategically move forward, but using that as a reason to set ourselves back can be very devastating. It takes a lot of conscious effort to be able to do that. So one of the processes of healing is not to allow our past experiences to determine where we are headed to. That is very key, and it can make a lot of difference. Okay, a lot of difference. So finally, we'll conclude with what we said from the beginning, that at the end of the day, let's recognize that despite all the disparities that we've talked about and how suggestions we could use to forge forward and all of that, how we could blend that line, the reality is that we're all Black people. Mm-hmm. Look at myself as a Ghanaian. Look at my wife as African American and Caribbean, representing the two groups. The reality is that look at us, we are Black people, and that's what makes the difference. It does not matter what history she has behind it, what history has behind it. We can respect each other's history if we learn about it. But at the end of the day, we remain Black people, and we have to find ways that we can meet and find common grounds that makes us forge together. Because whoever caused the separation between us does not want us to come together and recognize that we are both Black. So that things like this will keep coming up, and that will be things we'll be fighting about. And we should be fighting about the fact that maybe Black lives matter, or fighting about the fact that Black people deserve better in Africa or outside of Africa. We now have things that does not help our progress. We'll be fighting about things like that. So let's always remember that despite the disparities and all the things we could find why there's a conflict between us or there's a tension between us, we are Black people, and that's what is going to stand. So let's come together and unite and fight forward, because when we unite, that's when we can win. That's when we can win. That's when we can win. That's when you can win.
Yeah.
So let's look at some questions, and then we could bounce out of. Whoa, that's a lot. Okay, so
a lot of comments.
Great topic. I see a lot of yes. Okay, this one says continental Africans also don't acknowledge we work. That acknowledge the work African American people put in for Africans to even migrate to America. Yeah, I mean that's a legitimate concern. I always say that Africans in Africa, we need to really stand. Of course, these days we're doing well. Again, like I said, the current generation is really doing well in advocating also from the African side for things that are going on in America. Our forefathers did some bit during the civil rights era, but it wasn't enough. But today we're trying our best to keep doing more. So it's very important that Africans in Africa must add their voice constantly to this fight. So that's a legitimate concern, if I understood it. I think this one says, I think both sides are not exercising grace with each other. That's very true. We're not finding common grounds. And it's out of love that we can find common grounds, you know. And what does this one say? It says that but the key element missing is
they wouldn't be able to come without the efforts of African Americans in our constant fight for civil rights.
Right.
I
exactly.
think to her point.
I think it goes back to support the initial point, because that's a reality. If African Americans didn't fight, because those times when we're fighting the white man all the way until civil rights, of course, during the civil rights era, we had a lot of Africans also playing roles here and there. But before that, if African Americans were not resilient, maybe there'll be no America for African Americans to show up in the first place. Okay? For Africans to show up in the first. So that's a valid point. And this one says, I think African American are being the understanding
of their culture.
I think African American are losing the understanding of their culture. Well, yeah, I mean, I don't maybe understand.
Some of them may have not even understood.
Yeah, some people may not. Just as we on the African continent may not have really learned about what is going on here. A lot of African Americans too have not really learned.
From here.
Okay, let's look at
some comments
Instagram
here.
Is that from the top?
Yeah, I think there was no comment. So the first comment is, I was able to see the difference in the mindset between my husband and I. He is Ethiopian and I'm African American, and some of the trauma we are just now discovering. This is an interesting debate to me. My mom is from Baltimore City. My dad is from Nigeria. I've lived and traveled in both places. The microaggressions experiences are all very different, but it's important that we have the conversations and try to build together. My father is Jamaican. My mother is American. My education on systematic, and we have lost it. So we'll come back.
Yeah, just share. Okay. So let's read some comments here. Because assimilation is what has happened. Okay.
Should we go live again?
On Instagram?
Yeah. To finish or no?
Let's finish with this.
Okay.
African-centered education is a must. That's very true. African-centered, and that's what I'm talking about. Both here and in Africa. Here it has to be a lot, and in Africa as well. Is that I live in Ghana as a repat. Okay, for 3 years now, and a new citizen. That is 100% true. African Americans are judged faster than white Americans. That's very true too, but should not be the case. But it goes back to lack of information about African American experience. That's very true too. You know, it says we have to add into the curriculum, as you're saying. Yeah, it's very true. Okay, somebody says this one says what?
Mimicking black people for trolling. Okay. Yeah, we do have some ignorant people. Yeah. Yes, Native Africans must honor that as African Americans, we have a culture. We might be missing history prior to slavery, but what we built as a result of slavery has enhanced our entire race. Okay.
That's a valid point. What does this one say?
We just read that.
Okay, also check out something.
Oh, okay.
It's a good conversation.
There also should be understanding of colonization and how that also affects Africans from the continent, which I think you had mentioned that. Yeah.
Okay.
How colonization has affected.
More teachable moments. That's very true. Okay. It said, and for those who are returning back to Africa, try to shed the American ignorance. Yeah, I mean, at least share more of your knowledge, and that's what I talked about. All right, so thank you all so much for joining. you know, we appreciate you all. You can keep supporting Certified Africa. Next Friday we'll still come back on your way.
Yeah, if there's a topic that you want us to talk about,
yeah, you can always
message us,
push that through.
Send us a direct message to Instagram. Let's talk about it. Let's discuss.
You can follow us. You can follow us at Certified Africa. You can check out our website at certifiedafrica.com. You can always email us anything, any question. You can give us a call. That's our number on the screen. You can give us a call. And yes, let's talk.
This is our email. If you want to email us a topic, or you want to talk to us about, traveling, moving, or just whatever.
You can also check our online store and then buy something.
Yeah, support our online store. And if you have not, subscribe to our YouTube channel
below.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you. Have a blessed day. All right.